Hello and good evening, everyone. Before we end day one of the Hasanah Forum, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce you the next speaker who will be delivering the special address titled New Horizons of Financing Positive Social Impact. But first and foremost, heartiest congratulations to Tan Sri Shahril Ridzuan being conferred the Darjah Panglima Setia Mahkota just recently. Congratulations, Tan Sri. Tan Sri Shahril graduated with a Bachelor of Civil Law from Oxford University and Masters of Arts from Cambridge University. He was Khazanah's Managing Director from August 2018 to August 2021. And prior to Khazanah, he was the CEO of EPF, Managing Director of Malaysian Resources Corporation Berhad, and served at Pengurusan Dana Harta Nasional. Tan Sri Shahril is currently a non-executive board member of Malaysian Aviation Group Berhad and Malaysian Airlines Berhad. Well, perhaps something that not many people know, besides being an expert in the investment world, Tan Sri Shahril is also a gamer. So, if you see someone looking like him wandering around with a phone in his hand, don't be afraid to say hi. It is him, playing Pokemon Go. All right, let's get back to the serious stuff. Over to you, Tan Sri.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, very big thanks to Yayasan Hasanah, an organization that's very close to my heart. Thank you so much for your kind invitation for me to give a very short talk to the audience today. And today I'll be speaking a bit about corporate sustainability, a topic that's, I think, increasingly important as we think about the roles of individuals, organizations, governments, in relation to how we actually address some of the issues facing society. And what I will begin with basically is to talk a bit about how stakeholders actually want to see companies succeed. And by stakeholders, I mean basically not just the shareholders, but all those who are impacted basically by how companies actually perform in their wider community. It's a topic which I think will be increasingly important, as you can see basically from what's happening with COP26, the increasing obligation on companies to think about how they impact the environment, how they impact the community, and also how people perceive how companies actually perform. So let's talk a bit about that. And really where we start with is actually to think about how the global movement on ESG is actually starting to affect how companies actually think about these things. Now, there's a lot of news, a lot of data that you see in the markets, that you see basically out in the open about how ESG is growing and growing very, very fast. And in fact, there's a lot of predictions that basically ESG assets may be a third to a half of total global AUM by 2025. I wouldn't be surprised basically that this movement actually accelerates as increasing focus basically on the role of investors, the role of capital in essentially changing how companies behave becomes more and more important in the future. And we're seeing basically that kind of pressure really starting to arise now, even in traditional fund managers, even in traditional pension funds who previously didn't really think too much about these things. Now here in Malaysia, the core investment firms are all signatories to ESG principles. And by the core ones, I mean those who actually dominate how the capital markets perform in Malaysia. The EPF, QAP, PNB, Khazanah, all of them are actually signatories to ESG principles and have been very, very active, especially in recent years, in terms of promoting and engaging with companies that they invest in order for them to understand how this is going to change the future for them. Now, how has this actually started was with negative lists. The idea basically that investors would create lists of companies, industries that they wouldn't invest in. And those lists are expanding. I remember in my time when I was at the EPF, we started to think about these things very, very seriously. And we actually published a guideline that we set out to the public, very clearly stating the principles that essentially we would not be investing in certain types of industries which we felt were non-beneficial. So despite some of those industries being profitable, despite essentially being good from a shareholder return point of view, as an investor, we felt that we could not be associated with basically those industries. And those lists are expanding in the future. They're becoming not just negative lists, but essentially becoming positive filters as well. And how that works basically is that investors will start to look for companies which not just avoid doing evil, in the classic parlance of what Google used to say about themselves, but actually start thinking about companies which are actively trying to do a positive thing and trying to actively create value, not just from a financial point of view, but societal value in the long term. And this is a trend that you're starting to see overseas in a very big way, whereby ESG positive funds which are actively looking for positive companies, people who are going to make a difference, are becoming choices for the younger generation to put their money in. We are seeing increasingly, not just in the global markets, but even in Malaysia, increased interest by younger investors, people who are just starting out on their investing journey, to look for this type of assets, this type of investments, and looking for managers who will actually be aligned with their interests and aligned basically with how they see the real weight of the world in terms of basically the real issues and how their capital could potentially solve some of those issues. Now, the other thing as well that I think Malaysian companies need to be aware of as well is that the big investors in Malaysia have expanding global portfolios, meaning that over time, there will be a lowering of domestic weightage for balancing purposes, for risk management purposes, and therefore a lot of future competition for domestic investment money. And what that means for Malaysian companies basically is that not only will they start to struggle to attract global capital if they're perceived to be ESG negative, but even their traditional domestic investors will start to think twice about putting more money with them and eventually even start taking money out of investments with these companies. And this is a trend that you're starting to see in terms of basically how negative companies or companies with a negative perception about their ESG credentials are increasingly being affected by the flight of money in terms of the perception of their fund managers and their shareholders as to how they are actually acting in this world today. We talk a lot now about stranded assets. We talk about basically industries and companies which will over time will not be able to find or attract financing for their activities, no matter what kind of financial metrics they have in place to actually promise profits to their investors. Now, we think again about how this is affecting Malaysian companies, right? And a very classic example is Nasional Berhad, a really good company, very well run, fantastic operations, and which has over time, especially over the last decade or so, really improved across all fronts, both on its operating metrics in terms of its efficiencies, its financial metrics, one of the most profitable PLCs in corporate Malaysia. Yet, despite the steady growth in terms of numbers, which are essentially linked directly to the growth of the economy and the growth of GDP, and really minimal downside in terms of financial or operational risk, given basically their monopoly position as far as distribution and production and retailing of power is concerned in Malaysia, the share price basically has moved in relation to how ESG has actually developed. So you'd have seen basically from the year 2000 all the way up into the 2013s, 2014s, share price actually tracked performance, improved your performance. But really you started to see a period from 2018 onwards where ESG concerns started to really materialize and bite. And these ESG concerns actually have materialized really, really rapidly, especially over the last 5 years or so, right? From just concerns about how power generators and power distributors like Nasional globally are thinking about phasing out carbon-intensive sources, especially coal, to basically thinking about their own position into the mix of their renewable energy portfolio and whether basically they can be not just avoiding the negatives of coal, but actually investing positively into renewable energies so that essentially they can keep attracting investments. And what that has meant really for companies like Nasional, which have found it difficult to find local sources of renewable energy to start to offset basically their carbon-intensive activities, is that despite high dividends, despite steady cash flows, improving operations, improving financial metrics, right, ESG-sensitive investors and investors who are very mindful of their own ESG credentials, as far as their unit holders, as far as the people that they manage money for are concerned, have started to think twice about actually investing in these companies. Now, when I engage with your typical foreign investor, right, 10 years ago, this kind of concerns were still very much back of mind, still very much really just a growing sense, basically, that there's a movement towards thinking about these things. But if you actually talk to a global investor today, ESG concerns really are within the top 3 considerations they now have when they think about essentially investing. And more importantly, it's something which they have to think about seriously in terms of their own branding and their own perception that they're giving out to the market and to their potential clients about their own credentials as well. And we'll cover that slightly a bit further on in my talk. But that perception issue is really at the heart of ESG. Right? A lot of studies have been conducted to try and establish whether ESG investing has a net positive impact on financial returns. And all of the studies basically are still very much inconclusive. Right? It's a cause and effect issue. Is having good ESG practices a cause of better financial returns? Or is it just the case basically that the better companies, the ones who are performing better anyway, have more bandwidth and more understanding of ESG and therefore are actually implementing ESG in relation to basically their own very strong management? Right. So I think that really is something which is still cause and effect and which is really still unknowable as to the actual linkage between financial returns and ESG principles. But what's increasingly important and very, very evident basically is that the perception of positive or negative ESG has a direct impact basically on the investability of the company. So for companies which are perceived to have stranded assets, which are perceived to have basically a problem in terms of addressing the ESG issues, you are seeing basically a flight of capital. Right? And this is not just about industries or companies in very carbon-intensive sectors, even though that's really at the forefront of everybody's mind, with the environment and climate change really being a big issue. But it also affects Malaysian companies that have had perception issues in relation to how they treat foreign workers, for instance. We've seen flights of capital from our glove industry, from the plantations industry. And these are all issues which basically need to be addressed very, very strongly, not just by the companies and industries, but really by government and government policy. Right? How do governments think about the perception of the country really as a carbon emitter, the perception of the country basically as an abuser of human rights or an abuser of worker rights, right? Because this all really affects the investability of the country itself, right? And for a country like Malaysia, which depends tremendously on carbon-intensive industries, which depends basically on foreign workers and the treatment of foreign workers to actually fuel our industrial mix, these are huge issues because if we don't treat this correctly, if government policy does not start to step in line with how the world perceives these issues, then what will happen really is the investability of Malaysia and Malaysian companies will continue to deteriorate. And we've seen basically over the last 10 years, a large deterioration of the attractiveness of Malaysia as an investable destination for both its markets and its companies in the global eye. So when we think really about that future right now, what does that future bring? It's really about how companies think about their brand and how countries think about the perception of their country in the global marketplace. At the end of the day, the development of any nation, of an industry or a company is dependent on the availability of capital at cost-effective prices in order for us to really tap onto the infrastructure and the investments required to make changes. And those changes are important because it's not just about financial improvement to the well-being of the people, it's also about creating the kind of social changes that are needed for societies to advance and for the people to actually take advantage of their place in the modern world. So when we think about how brands will tap into the social changes that are taking place, there are a number of things which basically managements and boards need to think about. And in Malaysia in particular, these are things which I think have really accelerated to the point whereby if we're not already thinking about it, and then as a management or as a board, we are really falling behind today. And those things really are about how the perception of your company is actually just as important as the perception of the products or services that you produce. Right? Corporate branding in this day and age is just as important as your product branding, which is why you look at global companies, so much care and attention is actually paid towards how employees and customers think of them as a partner in their daily lives. Hugely important, right? Now you are seeing basically, especially in technology companies, this increasing burden or this increasing struggle for companies to prove themselves to not only their customer base and their investor base, but also their employee base. And in this day and age, when we're talking about a post-COVID world and talking about things like the Great Resignation, we're thinking about essentially how there's a massive talent shortage, a massive shortage basically for the kind of workers you need for the future. That struggle or that basically that competition for a technologically advanced workforce is being driven just as much by the qualifications that we as a government or a country can put to our people and bring them up to education, but also to the attractiveness of actually working in a Malaysian company, right? And it's because really today, the best employees, the employees who are going to create value for a company or for basically a country, are effectively very, very free to work in any market, any company in the world. Why would they work with a Malaysian company with a bad reputation or work in Malaysia if they feel Malaysia is not living up to its obligations or living up basically to its standard as a global citizen, when you could work in another country, when you could work in another company which actually conforms to your beliefs, to your values as well. So that competition really today for a corporation, for a company in Malaysia, is not just about market access, it's not just about market share, it's about can you even attract the right workers for yourself who will actually create the value for the future or help you to actually transverse basically the technological divide. Now, institutional shareholders, especially the long-term shareholders of Malaysia, have always been very patient, right? When I was with EPF, Khazanah, we've always been willing to sacrifice some short-term gains as long as companies are on the right track for the long-term future. Hugely important because Malaysia still remains our core market for investments, right? There is an innate inertia in terms of basically of local large institutional shareholders to keep putting money in Malaysia because a lot of liabilities on their balance sheet are Malaysian ringgit based. You want to have a balance of having really good Malaysian assets to offset basically against your ringgit liabilities and make sure basically that from a risk management point of view, you are able to do so. But if Malaysian companies are slow to actually take up this challenge, then even the long-term institutional shareholders of Malaysia will slowly start to think about how they engage with the local markets as well. Now, whenever I advise boards or management to think about these things, I always advise them basically that they have to be extremely careful of public opinion. Bad news has a huge compounding effect, and if you don't tackle it upfront, tackle it early in a very proactive manner, it can spiral out of control. Even if factually on the ground, objectively, you believe basically there's actually very little truth to it. Now, our struggles with things like worker rights, right, with the issues of how we treat foreign labor, has been a major issue in terms of our access to markets, particularly in the US. And this has affected multiple industries in Malaysia. Is there truth in a lot of those allegations? Is it really as bad on the ground as people say it is? Nobody knows. But as far as the public is concerned, right, things look really, really bad. And because of public pressure, because of political pressure that then arises in those key markets that we try to access, that bad news just gives an excuse for people who are lobbying against our industry, against basically our companies, to then take advantage and deny us access. So I always advise boards and management, right? If you have to address ESG concerns, address it concretely with actual budget commitments. You have to be seen to actually be doing something, not just doing it in the background. And like it or not, a lot of it is actually a war for public opinion. It's basically a need for boards and managements to actually think about how they are perceived to be actually engaging these issues. And when you engage with these issues, you have to engage with not just the issue itself and your customers. You have to engage with your workforce. Your workforce has got to believe that you are a company worth working for. Right? And you have to engage with regulators, both domestically and abroad. And you need to spend money on lobbying. That's the way of the world. You have to do it. You have to do it. So in conclusion, as we think about all these things, I'm always drawn to basically this quote attributed to Nelson Mandela, which is that the time is always right to do right. And I think that's a quote which is particularly resonant today in terms of how we think about what needs to happen, how companies, organizations, individually, all of us and governments need to act. And it's not just about doing the right thing. You have to be seen to be doing the right thing, as the public today basically has a very, very strong voice in terms of not just spending their money with you, it's also in relation to investing their money with you. It's in how they actually engage with their politicians and their governments to either support you or to basically oppose you in terms of denying you market access, in terms of basically tarring you with a bad name, so that essentially it's a problem that becomes a snowballing one and a one which you will then struggle to actually correct if you leave it too late. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very glad I've had this opportunity to spend a bit of time with you to think about these things. And I hope basically that those of you who are in a position to influence the organizations that you work with or that you work for start to really open up and engage with your managements, your boards on these issues. Right? It is basically the most pressing issue that I see going forward for companies in relation to basically how they engage with their markets, their workforces, their investors in the long run. And this pressure will continue to increase as the profile of global problems increases and social media accentuates and amplifies basically those issues. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I really thank you for spending time with me and for supporting Yayasan Hasanah in all their endeavors. With that, thank you very much.